All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the HodlCast. Today we have a very, very special guest, Caitlin Long, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but she has been a huge, she's made all these laws in Wyoming and pushed them forward and been a huge, proponent for the industry. And Caitlin, maybe you can just give a little background, how you got into Bitcoin and blockchain, and we'll take it from there.
Oh, sure. Well, I guess dialing back, I spent 22 years on Wall Street, and when the financial crisis hit, I knew something wasn't right with the mainstream explanation of what really happened. So I started to dig really deep. Spent a lot of time on both Austrian economics all the way over to the other side of the spectrum, modern monetary theory, which is really hot right now, and definitely landed in the Austrian school as the one that diagnosed the problem and the correct solution to it. But it was through those Austrian circles that I found Bitcoin in 2012, which was actually late by Austrian standards. A lot of people were talking about it, I'm sure, for quite a long time before that. It just didn't come across my desk until then. And I started buying it in 2013 and went all in 2016, professionally, leaving my day job and going all into, at the time, enterprise blockchain, but I'm now all in on the public blockchains for the last 14 months.
Nice. And there's been 13 crypto-friendly laws passed in Wyoming. What was your role with those, or how did it come to be your passion and your project?
Well, this is funny. It's International Women's Day. I keep seeing that on Twitter today, which is cool. And I just very quietly, I disclosed I started buying Bitcoin in 2013. So I had appreciated Bitcoin and wanted to donate it to fund an endowment for female engineers at my alma mater, the University of Wyoming. And the reason I picked female engineers was I saw how difficult it was when I was at Symbiont to hire female engineers. And there are lots of reasons for that, but it was difficult to find people. There just are not as many females, even if you try. And my dad had also been a professor there for 40 years in engineering college. So I was very quietly thinking I would, just make a donation. I've been involved with the university for a long time. And here's what happened. Wyoming's money transmitter law was so bad that the University of Wyoming couldn't find anybody to exchange the Bitcoin for them, and so they couldn't take it. And I said, well, let's go fix that. And it turned into, let's not just fix that, let's do a whole bunch else. And so Wyoming actually had one of the 3 worst money transmitter laws, and zoomed to the front of the pack on how crypto and blockchain friendly we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So, like, one of the new developments is you're recognizing direct property rights for individual owners. And can you kind of go over why that's so important?
Well, and you're an attorney, I think you can appreciate it. But for those of your listeners who are not, the way securities are owned in this country is really crazy. And it dates back to 1994, the Uniform Commercial Code, which is the base law of commerce. It's I like to call it the protocol layer of the legal system, because it is the foundational way that business transactions involving personal property occur in this country, and pretty much everything except for real estate is considered personal property. So it tells you what your rights and duties are, and it tells you when there's a lender who's lending against it, who's got the superior lien if there are indeed competing liens. So it's a lot of legalese here, but what's really important is that the entire securities industry in 1994 went from being a direct property right to being an indirect pro rata share in a pooled account at your securities intermediary, which is, they call it a property right, but as a lot of commentators have said, it's such an attenuated property right that it's a de facto contract claim. So what you have is, in other words, in plain English, you have an IOU against a leveraged broker-dealer, and if they go bust and they don't have in their account all the securities that they promised you, then you become a general creditor in bankruptcy. That's what happened to Lehman, that's what happened to MF Global, and it's a mess. So we used to have direct property rights prior to 1994 in securities. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. I actually think that was the greatest theft of property rights in human history. And the reason I say that is that the entire U.S. securities market stopped being a property right in 1994 and became a contract claim. And we all ended up losing, solid ownership rights. And instead we have IOUs. We're in a creditor relationship with leveraged financial counterparties. And, if you happen to get stuck at MF Global or Refco or Lehman or Bear Stearns, you weren't exactly in a good position.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So that's the background. And by the way, there are a lot of people who want to apply that to crypto too. And as you can imagine, that makes my head explode. The whole concept of not being able to directly own your assets is a big deal. And frankly, blockchain, as we all know, is in a position to clean up these issues in the securities industry because the assets are designed to be owned directly. You don't have this indirect system like in securities where some far-off company called the Depository Trust Company that nobody's ever heard of. Actually, technically, it's nominee CD & Co. But CD & Co. is the record owner of 99.999% of the securities outstanding in the United States. Well, in blockchain, you don't need an organization like that. We can all own our assets directly, and that's partly why I'm so attracted to blockchain, because it's not just about Bitcoin; it's about securities as well.
Mm-hmm. And so now in Wyoming, there'll never be a point in time where you can't, you have to give your ownership over to a bank or some type of other kind of institution as of this law. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And it's a big deal in part because Wyoming doesn't block that ability to turn your assets over to a bank. People, may have lots of reasons to do that. And most especially institutional investors, as you know, are required to do that for the assets that they manage. So when you have to use a third-party custodian, then the way Wyoming set it up is you still directly own your assets, but what you give up is control over them. So it's like valet parking for your car. It's actually what's called a bailment, which is one of the oldest legal relationships ever recognized. It long predates the United States. It's a common law concept of if I want to hand my asset over to someone who for safekeeping, then I just literally hand over control of it, but I don't actually hand over ownership of it. So you retain direct ownership in the assets that you have deposited in a Wyoming custodian. That is not available in the securities industry today because, as we said, 99.999% of securities are indirectly owned. And so that powerful concept of I hand over my asset for temporary control to you, but I still always own that asset, and therefore it's out of the bankruptcy estate of the securities intermediary. That doesn't exist in securities today, unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty important. And is that the thing I've been seeing on Twitter? You're posting as each other state, you're encouraging them to follow Wyoming's guideline, and a lot are following it, which is fantastic, but some are going the other way. And is that the issue that they're going the other way on?
That's the biggest issue. It's fun because, as you said, Wyoming passed 13 bills. Our ones from last year are, of course, the ones that are being enacted the most frequently in other states. Colorado's governor just 2 days ago signed the token taxonomy or the Utility Token Act into law in Colorado. So now we've got 3 states that recognize utility tokens as being exempt from state securities laws. Mm-hmm. And then I think there are 3 or 4 others that are doing it this year as well. And then Wyoming's exemption from the money transmitter law for virtual currencies has been proposed in at least Rhode Island and Iowa. There are, I think, a few other states on that one as well. But you're absolutely right. The question that you were asking directly is where you see me really kind of going after the other states that are trying to enact this indirect ownership regime. And encouraging them to pull that back and instead enact the Wyoming law. That's the most important one. So for your listeners, if they're wondering if they can get involved in any of their states, that's where I would encourage them to go. Try to, if you live in California or Oklahoma or Nevada or Hawaii, contact your local representatives and senators and have them vote those bills down.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, California is putting forward like a whole bit license type regime. And I thought I saw something where Hawaii had one bill that was going to make it kind of like Wyoming, like a very positive money transmission act, but it's been stalled and it hasn't gone forward. And that's almost a year in the making of this back and forth situation. So.
Yeah, I don't know what they did last year because they were, when I said Wyoming was one of the 3 worst money transmitter laws back in 2015, Hawaii was, and Minnesota were the other 2. And I know there are a lot of crypto folks in Hawaii that have been trying to fix that. I don't know what the history is last year, but this year they did propose this uniform law, and it's better than the bit license. Just like California, they proposed the same law. It's what's called the uniform law in those 4 states: California, Hawaii, Oklahoma, and Nevada. And it would introduce new regulations on cryptocurrency businesses. It's kind of like the bit license, but a lot less restrictive. The issue with that law, though, is that it forces everybody into this indirect ownership regime. And again, Wyoming is so much better because we're offering what's called super negotiability. All owners of digital assets, including individuals, you don't have to go to an institution to get that treatment.
Yeah, that's huge. And then, so some of the other things that have come forward, there's the FinTech Sandbox. Can you go over kind of how that works?
That one's really neat because it says as long as you're not hurting consumers and you're going to post a consumer protection bond and you apply with the local regulator in Wyoming, basically pretty much all of the financial regulations, again, except the consumer protection ones, you can get an exemption from by going into the sandbox. So in plain English, what this means is financial innovators, if you're not going to hurt consumers and a law is standing in your way, come into Wyoming because you can get an exemption in Wyoming for 2 years and can be renewed in 3 years. The idea there is if it's really that great of an idea in 3 years, look how fast the Wyoming legislature is willing to move, then you can get an exemption from Wyoming, a change in the actual Wyoming law. So it's really powerful for FinTech innovators to come into Wyoming. It's also reciprocal with other states. So Arizona has a FinTech Sandbox. Nevada, I saw, just introduced one. And it's also reciprocal with those overseas. So Bermuda, for example, has one as well. So you can actually link up these FinTech sandboxes and put together, a global business plan and be exempt from existing regulations as long as you're not going to hurt consumers and you get advance approval to do it.
Oh, nice. And so how does the state chartered, also that's another big thing, I think, and it might go kind of along the line of the first thing, but the state chartered depository institution. And maybe you can touch on the Operation Choke Points, application here too.
Yeah, great questions. And this, again, we get a little esoteric in this stuff because you see what we did last year is a little simpler than what we did this year, but what we did this year is much, much more meaningful. And so the State Chartered Depository Institution is designed to help fix the crypto industry problem, which is that the banking industry doesn't want to bank crypto companies. And the reason is that when you bank, the whole blockchain industry is considered a high risk industry by federal regulators. And so for banks that bank companies in one of these 30 high risk industries, it's not just us, then the banks actually are subject to heightened supervision. So that means more compliance costs, more compliance hassle, and higher risk that they're going to have their charter pulled by the feds in Washington. So the banks are not irrational. It's frankly even not their fault that they're making it so difficult to bank this industry. It was actually mostly the FDIC that was responsible for it. So what Wyoming did was say, all right, we're going to have a state chartered bank that's not necessarily going to be FDIC insured, and it's going to have 100% reserves. It cannot make loans because it's not FDIC insured. And it's just going to be a plain vanilla, boring bank that isn't going to pay interest on deposits. It's not going to be able to afford to do that, most likely, because it's not making loans. But it's going to specialize in the compliance needs of the blockchain industry, kind of like Silvergate and Signature and Metropolitan and Cross River, some of these smaller community banks that have just been awesome for the blockchain industry in the U.S. they've proven that it can be done without losing your bank charter. There are legitimate companies. We're not all criminals and drug dealers in this industry. There are legitimate companies that are in need of banking services, and these banks prove that it can be done. But there are such a small number of those banks that are willing to do it. So the idea is, let's get more of those banks going, and let's do it as state chartered banks in Wyoming. And then lastly, because FDIC insurance is optional, most likely I suspect these banks are not going to apply, because that's just an extra cost. And when you can't make loans, you generally don't need it. The reason why most banks fail is because loans go bad. And if this bank can't make loans, then it's less likely to fail, I would argue. But as a result, you're out. The bank is out from underneath who really was the bad actor in regulation that caused the banks in this industry to, or caused the banks not to bank this industry, rather. And that was Operation Choke Point. That started in 2013. It started with the payday lenders under the Obama Justice Department, and a lot has recently come out in litigation surrounding that the FDIC just forced banks to close the bank accounts of companies in industries that they didn't like. And it like I said, it expanded to 30 different industries before it was ended. But just in November, so just 4 months ago, 13 senators sent a letter to the FDIC saying, even though this is officially over, we know it's still going on, cut it out. Wyoming essentially just said, we're not waiting for the feds to get their act in gear. We're actually going to create a state chartered bank that's a real alternative.
And I wonder if that, if other companies that are having trouble with banking, even outside of the blockchain industry, might be attracted to that same bank.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question and a great observation, because one of the representatives in Wyoming is a firearms dealer, and he had a bank account closed because the bank decided no longer to bank that industry. It is one of the high risk industries, as you might imagine. So Wyoming's got a lot of politically incorrect industries. Coal is another one, and some of the biggest banks have pulled out of banking the energy industry, and that's been really painful for Wyoming. So it was this was Wyoming sort of planting a flag and saying, we're not going to let the feds bully us. And that's exactly what the lead senator said during testimony. This is an unbullyable bank. Mm-hmm. So, they can still, I guess, bully this bank on know your customer and anti-money laundering issues. That's federal law. Coin Center just put out an awesome report. I'm about halfway through it. Yeah, I had also written a piece for Forbes last fall about how I think the Bank Secrecy Act is unconstitutional, and Coin Center came to the same conclusion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but unfortunately, it's the law of the land, so we have to comply with it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, some of your statistics in that article from last year about the success rate of the Bank Secrecy Act was really made me kind of scratch my head of why are we doing this if it's really not catching anything that it's supposed, its goal is to catch money laundering, and it's done what was it, 0.005 or
0.0002% or something. Yeah. Conviction rate. Yeah. Well, and when they set it up in the 70s, the suspicious activity reports were set at a $10,000 level. Well, and now that's something like $80,000 today, right? But they're still having to file reports for every $10,000 bank transfer. It's, as Coin Center said, it's actually a government surveillance program. Yeah, and I agree with them. I think that's exactly what it is. And the article that I'd written last fall was under the Carpenter case, which the ACLU prosecuted all the way up to the Supreme Court. That was the cell phone data collection case. The justices 5-4 came out and said that's a government dragnet without a warrant. And under the Fourth Amendment, you actually have due process. The government can't just throw out a dragnet. You have to actually have a warrant in order to collect that data. And I'd said at the time, I wish that Supreme Court case had come out before Coinbase threw in the towel on the IRS John Doe summons that it received. Yeah. Because they threw in the towel after, a year and a half trying to fight it in court. And then 2 weeks later, out comes this Supreme Court case. And I just thought, the timing's just unfortunate. Because Coinbase might have continued that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying I was watching that Carpenter case really closely because I've become fairly close with Lynn Albright, and we thought that that case would, at that point, they still had a petition in to get to the Supreme Court, and when they heard that they were waiting for the result of Carpenter, and then when Carpenter came out that way, that yes, you do need a warrant, if it's needed for the cell phone, it would be a logical extension to say, well, yes, you also need a warrant to search the laptop, in which case Ross's situation would be completely need to be reviewed again, but then they declined to hear his case. So
yeah, I saw that. That's so interesting. Well, on the interesting question, some people have said, well, how is it that cell phone data collection has anything to do with the Bank Secrecy Act? Well, the case that they had used that allowed them in their own mind, and and they were affirmed, I think, at the district and appellate level in this, that allowed them to collect that data was the 1978 case, Miller, I think it was, that said that the Bank Secrecy Act was constitutional. But here's the thing. The Bank Secrecy Act back then just collected the name and address of the account holder. Now it's with the travel rule, not only do you have to know your customer's source of funds, but you have to know your customer's source of funds. And now they do suspicious activity reports on everything $10,000 and above. And it's just the dragnet has gotten so wide. It's very similar. If you read the Carpenter Supreme Court case, which is a really short case, really short opinion, and just replace it with Bank Secrecy Act, and then realize that what they did was essentially open the door wide open for a challenge to the Bank Secrecy Act, because they essentially overturned what was relying on the Bank Secrecy Act. So we're, I think, a few years away from what is a serious constitutional challenge to the Bank Secrecy Act. So all this know your customer and anti-money laundering stuff, I think, is ultimately going to get narrowed. But unfortunately, it's the law of the land right now. And we're stuck with it. It's a federal law that every state has to comply with, unfortunately.
And the punishments are so severe that it's like, you kind of gotta, it is what it is at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and ultimately, that's the biggest risk to any bank, whether it's the new special purpose depository institution charters in Wyoming, or whether it's any, federal or state bank anywhere. They can lose their bank charter if they screw up know your customer and anti-money laundering and OFAC and, anti-terrorism financing and all that. So the compliance risk is really high. It actually has gotten to the point where the compliance officers are really in charge of these banks, to be blunt. And the compliance costs have just soared. Silvergate actually disclosed they have 65 compliance officers reviewing customer onboarding applicants. For the 535 customers, they have 65 compliance officers. Yeah. So, but that's what it takes to keep the FDIC and Justice Department off your back. And unfortunately, right, again, it gets back to what's the cost of all of this? It's been imposed on the private sector compared to the benefit to the government in catching money launderers. And that was a government, the GAO report from, I think it was 1996. So it's old, but it's the last time they studied the Bank Secrecy Act. And it was laughably useless. Like you said, it was 0.0002% conviction rate on suspicious activity reports. So this is it's really a dragnet. It's not truly trying to solve the money laundering problem. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sounds like you agree.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just trying to navigate for clients to interact with this Bank Secrecy Act. I started, I kind of got into Bitcoin through working for an ATM company back in 2014, and just learning all this. At first we thought maybe it was like selling a bag of chips. They'd walk up to the ATM, they buy their Bitcoin, they put their cash in, that's it. And then it was like really clear, there's a whole lot more to go through than that. And it seems whatever. It is, it's the lay of the land. There's no point in fighting it, or no point in being too upset with it right now. It's just what we have to go through to do business. But
but I think this industry should get ready for that. And I'm hoping that when somebody gets, when the government picks an enforcement action on the Bank Secrecy Act for this industry, that the industry rallies around whoever that is and helps them to defend it, because this is everybody's got an interest in this, and that's one of the reasons why I so like the Coin Center's report coming out about the privacy coins, because it really does get at the heart of what's coming with Lightning Network and Monero, Zcash, and all the other privacy coins that are coming. It's not going to be possible to comply with the travel rule. And so does that mean that every transaction is illegal? Of course not. So how do we square that peg, that round hole? It's going to be difficult. But I think litigation's coming, and it may come in those privacy coins.
Yeah. And did you see, sorry, we've gotten a little off track, but did you see the Canada Revenue Agency put out a questions to Bitcoin users in Canada, asking them specifically if they're using mixers, and then why they would be using mixers? Like, it was very, in-depth, kind of, too far of
I didn't see that. Yeah. Wow.
And Canada has been very lax on their tax application to Bitcoin. I think they only put guidance out, recently, and it's from it to go from, pretty much not enforcing any tax stuff on Bitcoin to, why are you using a mixer, and tell us where it went and show us a history of your transactions. It's pretty
yeah.
But
well, it's coming, I think, in the United States, and that's why Coin Center is trying to get ahead of it. And those of us in the industry, we really should stay vigilant on this and do the best we can to get ready. And I think, again, one of the biggest challenges is going to be when they go after somebody in this industry. And there are a lot of people with standing to sue on this right now. Everybody who had a bank account closed, it actually probably has standing to sue on that right now. But the industry doesn't really have a way for the groups to get together, right? We don't really have a centralized, I know that's a bad word, but in this case, a centralized organization to, like the ACLU or someone, whose job it is to go litigate this stuff. That's what the ACLU does. And we don't have anything like that in this industry, but I think eventually it'll be obvious that it's coming. And Coinbase for a while fought the good fight and then threw in the towel on the IRS John Doe summons. There'll be others who will face the same thing, and I hope the industry closes ranks and supports them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like the more people that register in Wyoming, like that base their companies there, even if they're not physically there, then at least there's a barrier of protection. They have to pass, there is the supremacy clause for the, federal laws versus the state laws, but with what you've done in the way that you've crafted the legislation for the utility token, it brings it into the UCC domain, which I think makes it harder, from my understanding anyway, that makes it a lot harder for the federal agencies to attach to it, because the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code, is primarily a state objective. Mm-hmm.
You got it. You understand exactly what we did and the importance of it. Yeah, we put it under the purview of property law. And as you say, property law, the commercial code, Uniform Commercial Code, is absolutely state jurisdiction. The feds can't trump it. So, so what it boils down to is securities law very clearly is the feds have supremacy over the states. Property law, commercial law, the states have supremacy over the feds. That's established law, and that's the way it works. And so the question is then, which bucket is the utility token in? Is it in the securities bucket, or is it in the property bucket? And Wyoming and now Colorado and Arizona, notice they're all, by the way, Western states. As Eric Voorhees tweeted out today, finance is moving west. Yep, indeed. It's moving into so-called flyover country. And I can't wait to see the assets move out there. But in any event, that's where the challenge to the states or to the feds is actually bubbling up. And now I believe we're at 7 states total that have either enacted or are in the process of enacting similar language. So that is a pretty big number out of the 50 states, and it's just 1 year in. All the crowdfunding rules got put into place because the state started pushing back against the SEC. And this is following that exact same pattern, but on a faster time frame, which is awesome.
Yeah. And one of the things, so I was looking at it from the UCC side. So software and electricity went through the same kind of battle, where was it federal or was it state? And now I think more than half the states consider both of those things as tangible consumer goods. And how do you make electricity and software tangible? Well, the same way that you make a consumer token a tangible good, like, you know, it's already there.
Deem it that. Yeah, exactly. You deem it that. So,
and you know, 20-year body of case law that goes through each, like, you know, can you see it? Is it movable? Can you track it from place to place? And like, they've created all of these elements that go into that determination. And I think the blockchain works almost identically to electricity. Like, it moves from one place to another, and you can track where it moves and when. And
Yeah, that is a great point. And it's really funny. One of the other things we did, as I'm sure you noticed, is we created a way to locate the crypto assets in Wyoming, which engineers will scratch their heads and say, you know, what do you mean by that? But basically, if it touches the state of Wyoming, in other words, if it's owned by a Wyoming resident or owned by a Wyoming business entity, which may not actually, you know, whose owners may not actually be in Wyoming, and or if it's in a Wyoming digital asset custodian, or if it's in cold storage in Wyoming, you know, there's so many ways to get Wyoming, a nexus to Wyoming jurisdiction. And as Andrea Tiniano wrote in her Forbes piece yesterday, she figured out, it's sort of funny, she and I are good friends, and I didn't realize she was such a UCC expert. I should have used her back when we were drafting the bill, because it's, as you know, the UCC is so esoteric, it's so detailed. We had so many law professors and lawyers from law firms commenting. I should have reached out to her. I didn't realize she had that expertise, but she figured out pretty quickly, you guys defined everything as a possessory security interest, which means that you're perfecting the security interest by control. In other words, the lien becomes enforceable because the lender controls the asset. Okay, engineers probably are saying, okay, great, that is how crypto works. If a lender is going to lend against Bitcoin, then they darn well better control the asset and have sole control over the asset. Or you could have a smart contract that does it. But here's the nuance. Possessory security interests are governed by the laws of the state where the asset's located. So, now I just put a big puzzle piece together for you. So she said, wait a minute, Wyoming basically is going to be the jurisdiction of all digital assets in the United States. And I said, yeah. And she said, you guys are being magnanimous in encouraging other states to enact this same law, because right now, if everybody else enacted a different law, all the assets would still go to Wyoming. And she's right. She didn't, of course, say it, and I'm paraphrasing her words. I would encourage you to read the Forbes piece. She was a little more subdued in the Forbes piece, but it was a fun conversation to see the light bulb go off, and her starting to think about what would happen if, you know, if there's non-Wyoming residents in a lawsuit, what's a judge in Delaware going to do with this Wyoming law? And it's so well established that possessory security interests are not governed by the state of domicile of the borrower, which is normally where the UCCs get filed. It's governed by the state where the collateral is located. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be fun. You know, there'll be litigation on that over the years too, but it's going to be fun.
You're set up well. That was another thing, the Chancery Court, which is a huge deal too. You're going to have, I think it's 3 judges, and it's all, the budget has been approved, that they'll only be looking at blockchain related cases. Is that?
Well, it's not just blockchain, it's all business cases. It's modeled after the Delaware Chancery Court, and right now Wyoming courts are courts of general jurisdiction. So the judge might be hearing, a $100 million business dispute, and then, the next case is a DUI, or then the next case is a divorce or something like that. So what we've done is create a specialized court for business disputes, and there are two benefits to that. One is that you don't have to, if both parties agree, try it in front of a jury. And generally speaking, businesses don't want to try business disputes in front of a jury because they're generally esoteric and maybe, not always sympathetic cases. And then the other thing is that you've got a judge who's up to speed on all of the business issues. So therefore, you just don't have the risk of having, to wait for a long time to get a multi-day trial on the calendar. And then also, that the judge himself or herself is going to not take forever to make a decision because they already understand the issues. So it's going to take, a little time for Wyoming to get that up and running. But as you said, to me, that was the last piece missing for Wyoming. It's got great privacy laws, great tax laws, great corporate laws. It invented the limited liability company in 1977, so it's got a history of innovation. And the last piece was the Chancery Court for business disputes. So yeah, I think you're going to very quickly see, and I'm seeing it already in just the incoming volume. People are telling me they set up their business in Wyoming. There's a lot of blockchain companies in Wyoming, and that's going to be the place where litigation is probably going to take place.
I think from the time I started at this firm, there's been a few times where someone really wants to be set up in their state for whatever reason, but the vast majority of any LLCs we've done have always been through Wyoming. And, as you keep developing the laws more, it's, I think every one of them are always proud too, that they're associated with it. And it's quite a fun movement, and, just awesome to watch more and more come forward with it.
Oh yeah, indeed. It's, there's a nice little community, but we have no infrastructure. People are asking us, who do we talk to about job boards in Wyoming and where to move in Wyoming? And unfortunately, we're all ragtag volunteers, and we're just funding this out of our own pockets. We haven't raised any money other than just to cover, our cocktail event expenses when we've had them in Cheyenne during the legislative session. That's it. It's, this is an informal group, and it just shows you the power of crowdsourcing and just, when I've thrown open the request for people from this industry to come, one guy came from New Zealand and one came from China, and, of course, a lot came from Colorado. IOHK, moved from Hong Kong to Wyoming. So they sent folks too. It's just been awesome to see how many people literally just show up when I put out the call. It's such a fun industry. And everybody deserves the credit because we did this together. I just happen to be the face of it, but clearly, truly, the Wyoming legislators and the governor deserve the credit because they had the power to make it happen. But it's just regular folks in Wyoming and all over the world who also supported this, who showed up and made it happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems Wyoming has that kind of culture. You had posted a photo of the sign. What was the tagline of it? I forget what it is, but it was something.
Wyoming, it will blow you away. There's that one. Yeah,
something like that, or something else that was kind of anti-federal government, or that's how I read it. I forget what it was.
But there's a lot of that in Wyoming.
That's what to do, kind of attitude.
Oh yeah. Well, and to be honest, we talked earlier about the direct ownership and how the Uniform Law Commission, that law that's been proposed now in 4 states, and it's actually proposed by the Uniform Law Commission. The Uniform Law Commission it's a nonprofit that's designed to try to keep the laws uniform in the 50 states, especially when it comes to commercial law, so that businesses actually, have an easier time. And that's a laudable goal, but only if the laws are actually good laws. And what they were proposing is to pigeonhole all digital assets into the indirect ownership regime. The reason why I brought that up in response to your question about Wyoming versus the feds is when that letter landed in the Wyoming legislators' inboxes, how do you think the Wyoming legislators reacted to that based on the culture of Wyoming, right? Mm-hmm. It was one of the Senate leadership guys said, who do these people think they are that they can tell us what to do? And there was an attorney who, after this was all over and we disclosed all this, in the Wyoming Telegram channel said, the Illuminati of the legal industry just can't believe that little Wyoming pulled this off. And I think he captured the spirit there. Mm-hmm. There's a history of independence in Wyoming. It was, I think, the second to the last state to up its drinking age to 21. And it was the last state, I believe, to drop its speed limit to 55 in the 70s. I mean, it doesn't like to be told what to do by the feds, for sure, and will go to bat for its industries. And to the extent that we get more and more blockchain companies actually showing up in Wyoming as registered voters in Wyoming, I think that increases the chance that to the extent that we have issues with the feds in the future, that Wyoming steps up and goes to bat to defend the blockchain industry.
Nice. It's very inspiring. And there's another big piece to this too, the tax side of things. I think there's a lot of it's very advantageous to be based out of there because there are no state taxes, but there's also some other more nuanced applications for the blockchain companies, and maybe you could touch on those.
Yeah, so on the tax issue, of course, nobody's giving tax advice here, but there's no personal income tax, no corporate income tax, and no franchise taxes, and no gross receipts taxes. And there's also no property taxes on crypto. That was a bill we got passed last year. And there's also no state tax, no sales taxes rather on crypto, because of the way, again, the way that this incredibly talented legislative attorney drafted all these laws. He just is amazing. Big hats off to him. I should have said biggest thanks of all go to him, because he's the one who was the brains behind it all. But he, it just incredible execution. And one of the things that got drafted is we're classifying in Wyoming digital assets as intangible personal property. Sales taxes apply to tangible personal property, not to intangible personal property. So it's another one of the little wrinkles that's pretty darn good. So to wrap it all up, what it means is there's almost certainly not going to be any tax paid on crypto assets in the state of Wyoming by those who are subject to its tax regime. So come on in. There are a lot of people who are paying a lot of corporate income taxes and franchise taxes and the like in other states. Now, we can't solve the federal issue, of course, just to make it clear. We're talking about state taxes, not federal taxes here. But there are 25 enterprise or opportunity zones in Wyoming. For those who want to do some federal tax structuring, go look up opportunity zones, and then there are 25 of them in Wyoming, so you can do some interesting tax structuring with your tax advisor in Wyoming on federal as well with opportunity zones. So I think I missed the second part of your question.
No, you answered it. I was saying that I knew that there were no state taxes on it, but I didn't know the franchise and the corporate tax, all those extra benefits.
Delaware's franchise taxes they've raised their franchise taxes a lot, and they just raised them last year on their top 2,000 filers. So these are going to be like, the GEs and Procter & Gamble's and Apple's of the world, the gigantic companies, right? They're now all paying, I think it is $250,000 a year just for the privilege of being registered in Delaware. And if you think about the present value of that over 30 years, right, that's what you're paying in your shareholder value and your shareholder funds just for the privilege of being domiciled in Delaware. So I would encourage every one of your listeners who has a company, go ask your tax guy or gal, how much are you paying to Delaware in franchise taxes? And then how much would you save if you go to Wyoming? I think I venture to guess that 99.9% of your of folks who do that are going to discover that there's a pretty big cost difference to being domiciled in Delaware versus Wyoming.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess like kind of the final thing, the money transmission laws. So it's been, we kind of touched on it that when at the beginning you explained went from the worst to the best. And then there's been some debate around lightning channels and if money transmission laws apply to them. And I think it's a very unsettled thing. And I don't want to, I'm a huge fan of the Lightning Network, and I would certainly hope that these money transmission laws don't apply to it. But I think if they do domicile all the nodes in Wyoming, would that have any significance or?
Well, it's interesting because actually Carol Van Cleef, who's one of the thoughtful attorneys in this space, answered that question. I asked her that question in the Wyoming Telegram channel. And, of course, what you get in something like this is it's not clear is the answer. There's going to be legal risk. In Wyoming, it is clear. The challenge is that where the resident is domiciled is where the money transmission law apparently applies. So if somebody is in California and they're using a Wyoming Lightning node, unfortunately, still the California money transmitter law in theory would still apply, and that was the answer. So the challenge is, and this gets back to the Coin Center paper, which I think was so prescient and so timely, that when you get into these kind of privacy coins, how is the government really truly going to be able to claim that it has jurisdiction over these things? And where do you define it? as located. Again, if a lender wants to locate the asset, they're going to take control of the asset and they're going to put it in Wyoming or a Wyoming connected entity. So what we were talking about earlier about located in Wyoming, that's really for lenders to get control, to get very clear legal rights in a loan, that they can foreclose on the Bitcoin if the client doesn't pay back their loan, and then they can, sell the collateral for themselves. That we were talking about for loans. What I'm talking about for Lightning is different. This is for people just using the Lightning Network. And, it's unfortunately in most other states really not clear. So I think this is one of those things where the industry kind of needs an American blockchain, what's the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, so American Blockchain Liberties Union, or a branch of the ACLU whose job it is to go and litigate this stuff. And at some point, someone, I hope, will fund that as we get more litigation in this industry.
You just said something that kind of set off a little light bulb for me is, so the way the FinCEN regulations apply to the blockchain, or Bitcoin money transmission, there's a difference between a user, an exchanger, or an administrator. The user is just a general person doing the transaction, and they're not required to, file as a money service business. So if all the Lightning Network individuals would be considered in that user category, then the laws shouldn't apply to them, I don't think. But if they come in the category of exchanger, then they're required to register with FinCEN, report any large transactions. And to be an exchanger, they have to be in the business of performing money transmission. So if someone is just in the background running a Lightning node, I don't know if that, I guess the line will be what makes someone in the business of doing this. And I guess if they're making a profit from running the node, then that could make an argument that they are in the business of it. But
that's why this is just not clear, right? Here's what I think really truly needs to happen. The Uniform Law Commission needs to go back and reopen, since no states have enacted the Uniform Regulation of Virtual Currency Businesses Act. Remember that was out 2 years ago. No states have enacted it. 4 states have proposed that, along with the Supplemental Act we talked about earlier. So that's California, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Hawaii. And I believe I saw Rhode Island has proposed the URVCBA, but not the Supplemental Act. So maybe it's 5 states on the URVCBA. The reason I'm sharing that is the URVCBA was designed to try to pull out of any possible regulation just regular node operators on these networks. And so it's literally designed to pull out the money transmitter license requirement. That's one of the good things that it did do. But think about how much has changed since 2017. And the bad thing that the URVCBA and of course the Supplemental Act did is it turned assets in this industry into entitlements that you have to keep at a securities intermediary in order to get super negotiability for your assets. So, I really do think the Uniform Law Commission needs to go back to the drawing board. They jumped the gun too fast. That was the point of the Bitcoin Foundation in opposing the whole thing. This was just not ready yet, and I think they got too restrictive, and they didn't understand applying the indirect ownership regime to digital assets is like crossing the stream, so to speak. It's not going to end well, and so. We should go back to the drawing board, and given everything that's happened, especially with privacy coins, some of them were out in 2017, but Lightning Network wasn't. Most of the deliberations around that law were 2015 and 2016. Think about how much has changed since then, and consider whether you want a state enacting a law that it was based on deliberations back then. So, we should just pull them all back. If you're in those states, Andrea Tiniano's article actually had hyperlinks to the laws. So if you're in those states, go to her article and you'll find the hyperlink in your California, Hawaii, Oklahoma, or Nevada bills. And then you just call your local legislators. From having been around the legislative process, I can say this. Grassroots activities do matter. They do listen to local voters. And all you have to do to get a bill killed is get enough uncertainty built around it It's stunning what Wyoming did in passing all 13 bills, because there are 13 steps in the Wyoming legislative process at which any bill could fail at any one of those 13 steps, right? It's designed not to pass legislation. So if you, and I think I saw a statistic, Wyoming only passed something like 25% of the bills that were proposed this year. So vast majority of bills don't get passed. So we can get these bad laws, defeated in those states that have introduced them, and try to get everybody back to the drawing board and update everything so that we can have, things like Lightning Network and privacy coins not trigger the money transmission license requirements in all 50 states. That would be a huge win.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, that would be so much. Even if we just had one guidance of the money transmission, but to try and figure out on each state side is just, it's
a mess.
Yeah.
It's a mess.
It could go back up to that, what you had said earlier with the inflation of, the 10,000 limit that is imposed for when you need to do the suspicious report. If that could go up to 10,000 for the inflation adjustment, well, that would be a whole lot different of a ball.
Yeah. It really would be, but that's Congress for you. They love their surveillance.
Yes. Yeah. And then, so Wyoming also has some special. So for Bitcoin miners, I think you put some new things that they can do there as well. Can you go over those?
So Wyoming's an energy intensive state. It's like West Virginia, super reliant on its coal industry. And as you can imagine, the coal industry is not doing well in the last few years and may never come back. And so what happened is we did two things. Because it's such an energy intensive state, in theory it should have cheap electricity, but in reality, because it's such a big state, the transmission costs actually make it higher than you might think, because that's to go over such long distances. So we haven't had a lot of Bitcoin miners and crypto miners show up in Wyoming for that reason. So what we did is two things. One is allow the electric utilities not to have to go through the normal rate making process in order to quote bulk wholesale electricity costs to miners in this industry, as long as all of the, rewards and losses stay exclusively with the shareholders of the utility. So it just cuts out all the bureaucracy and lets the utilities and the mining companies negotiate directly with each other. The other thing is the miners have now announced in two cases, I believe, they're shutting down the coal plants before their useful life expires, because they're just too expensive to operate. So if those coal plants get pulled out of the grid, they don't actually have to pay the transmission costs. And as a result, then you can pay the really, really cheap base electricity costs. And so the idea is, instead of having the electric utilities shut the coal plants down, which of course is going to be terrible for the coal industry in Wyoming, why don't we try to keep them open? I know that a lot of folks from an environmental perspective will object to that, but I will say this: Wyoming has the cleanest coal in the United States by far. It's the lowest sulfur coal. But try to keep those plants open. It's very meaningful to a lot of people who work in that industry in Wyoming, and try to keep those plants open. And if the electric utilities don't want to operate them anymore, maybe crypto miners and others will. So that's the idea, is that now if the electric utilities are shutting them down, they actually have to go out and try to sell them first. So if crypto miners want to own a coal plant in Wyoming, I think there might be a couple coming online, and actually a few that are probably a few more over the next few years.
Wow, exciting.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, there's been some Twitter memes going on questioning if Wyoming exists.
Oh, in the beginning, it was really, really funny. It actually apparently traces back to a Garfield cartoon in 1989, which is actually really funny. Yeah, it was, have you ever met anyone from Wyoming? Have you ever been to Wyoming? And it's actually kind of funny in a Garfield kind of way. And for whatever reason, it just took off. In fact, actually, when SpaceX launched its rocket this week, the mission control people said the rocket is over the place that some people don't think exists, the state of Wyoming. It's actually in the mission control. Yeah, you can go back and listen to it. So, but look, it's just one of those Twitter memes. One of the best responses was party in the hot springs, the Yellowstone hot springs. And I think you were in that meme. So
yeah.
was a meme responding to a meme. And it was, hey, we're partying in Wyoming and come on in. And, I like that one for sure.
Yeah. It's actually my fiance is a DJ, or like he created that.
Is he?
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
Don't create that one, but
I see him in the background there.
Wyoming, so DJ Pepe lives in Wyoming.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. Absolutely. That is so funny. I hadn't realized that connection, but I knew you were in there, and Naomi, and who else was in there?
Stacy.
Stacy, yeah, of course, yeah.
Rosa, Adela.
Yeah. It was on International Women's Day. If you want to go, figure out who are some women in crypto, go look at that meme.
Yeah.
Because your fiance pulled a lot of us in. It was very, very well done, very funny. And of course, he was at the center of it.
Yeah. Anyway, it's funny, these memes, but yeah.
Oh yeah.
How far-reaching they can get, into the
amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, there are whole Twitter accounts that are dedicated to the Wyoming Doesn't Exist. There's a Wyoming Research Project one. Coin Yeezy is another one. And again, some of this stuff is funny, but and some of it's very, very clever. You've got to laugh, but it does start to get a little old. What's that?
As they say sometimes, all press is good press. So maybe it draws more people to the crypto space of knowing about Wyoming once they do that and start looking into it. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. If you pay any attention to crypto Twitter, it's been hard to avoid this meme because it's just everywhere. Wyoming doesn't exist. And it's what do they say that when you're driving through Wyoming, it's all a dream and you end up naked in Canada. And so for whatever.
I don't know where they come up with it. But.
Yeah. It's kind of amusing. Wyoming.
One of them, I think they said that you were actually artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I don't think artificial intelligence could have,
pulled this off. Yeah.
Put on the ground in the legislature in Cheyenne. Yeah. Yeah. I guess the only thing that I seen in that meme that caused me pause is when people said this is all just a scam to try to get your private keys in Wyoming. And of course couldn't be further than the truth, because it's yes, of course, we're making it easy for people to store their private keys in Wyoming, but the state of Wyoming has nothing to do with your private keys, nor does it want anything to do with your private keys ever. So and
that's kind of what the spirit of these laws are, that people keep their keys. So yeah,
of course, absolutely. And we're just giving you'll appreciate this. I like how Trace Mayer says it. He's an attorney by training too. That we're just creating backwards compatibility for this new technology within the legal system. And technologies can't exist in a vacuum. The legal system and technology systems are discrete systems. They both have protocol layers, and the protocol layer that applies to the legal system is the commercial law, and that's state law, and that's what we did here. We just basically green-lighted everything in the best possible way to try to respect the direct ownership, decentralized nature of the technology.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward. Oh yeah, I want to tell everyone about the event in May.
Yes, we're going to have another Wyoming Blockchain Task Force in May. A lot of people have been asking, is there going to be some sort of a Visit Wyoming event? And I think what we're going to do, we don't know the dates yet. It'll probably be sometime in the latter half of May, so after New York Blockchain Week, where we'll do something in Jackson Hole. And if you've never been to Jackson Hole, oh my gosh, it is truly the most beautiful place in the United States, if not the most beautiful place in the planet, on the planet. It is spectacular and breathtaking, and it's right next to Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks as well. So we'll probably do something. We're going to do a Wyoming Blockchain Task Force for a day and a half or so, and then maybe a day and a half for folks to come in and learn, make connections with the local law firms, learn about the laws, make connections with the local accountants. Teton County itself, which is where Jackson Hole is located, is very close to the end of a pilot to put their land records on a blockchain, working with Medici Land Governance, which is an Overstock subsidiary. So there's a lot going on in Wyoming for blockchain. There's a very active meetup group in Jackson as well. So I think if you've got visitors who are interested in coming to Wyoming, that would be a good time to do it. Stay tuned. I'll put it out on Twitter, and maybe you can retweet it once we get all the logistics set up.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your taking
great fun.
This.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
what's fun also to, Yeah, this is great. It's fun also because you're a lawyer by background. So you were interested in digging in on a couple of, layers deeper than some others. So this is a different kind of interview. We went deeper into the legal stuff. I hope it didn't lose too many of your listeners.
Well, the ones that'll be interested in it, at least there's somewhere to go to find it. And I'll find all my clients that we have set up their LLCs there. They're always asking me, like, what does this mean? What does this mean? And it's good for me to, hear it straight from you exactly how each of these things really works to benefit them. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, keep going. Keep sending them to Wyoming. That's great. We need more folks like you. And as the word gets out, this is going to be the legal home of this industry. And I couldn't think of a better one within the United States. It's just more philosophically aligned with this industry. It respects property rights. It's not going to tax it. And there's just such a culture of property rights and low taxes in Wyoming and privacy. It just fits with the ethos of this industry. So within the U.S. borders, I don't think you'll find a better place than Wyoming.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye-bye.